Esio Trot by Roald Dahl. Mr Hoppy lived in a small flat high up in a tall concrete building. He lived alone. He'd always been a lonely man, and now that he was retired from work, he was more lonely than ever. There were two loves in Mr Hoppy's life. One was the flowers he grew on the balcony. They grew in pots and tubs and baskets, and in summer the little balcony became a riot of colour.
A little spot of water for you, I think.
Mr Hoppy's second love was a secret he kept entirely to himself. The balcony immediately below Mr Hoppy's jutted out a good bit further from the building than his own, so Mr Hoppy always had a fine view of what was going on down there. This balcony belonged to an attractive middle-aged lady called Mrs Silver. Mrs Silver was a widow who also lived alone, and although she didn't know it, it was she who was the object of Mr Hoppy's secret love. He'd loved her from his balcony for many years, but he was a very shy man, and he'd never been able to bring himself to give her even the slightest hint of his love. Every morning, Mr Hoppy and Mrs Silver exchanged polite conversation, the one looking down from above, the other looking up. But that was as far as it ever went. The distance between their balconies might not have been more than a few yards, but to Mr Hoppy, it seemed like 1,000,000 miles.
Oh, good morning, Mrs Silver. Didn't see you down there for a minute.
Good morning, Mr Hoppy. How are you today?
Fine, thank you, Mrs Silver. All the finer for seeing you, Mrs Silver. All the finer. Oh, you don't know how much I long to invite you up for a cup of tea and a biscuit, Mrs Silver. Oh, perhaps today I will. Yes, I will. Mrs Silver?
Yes, Mr Hoppy?
But every time he was about to form the words on his lips, his courage failed him.
Would you...
Yes, Mr Hoppy?
Would you tell me the time, please? My watch seems to have stopped.
As I said, he was a very, very shy man.
Oh, if only I could do something tremendous, like saving her from a gang of armed thugs. It's all right, Mrs Silver. I'm here. Mr Hoppy is here to save you.
Mr Hoppy, my hero, my hero.
If only I could perform some great feat that would make me a hero in her eyes. If only.
But the trouble with Mrs Silver was that she gave all her love to someone else. And that someone was a small tortoise called Alfie.
Alfie? Alfie! There you are. And how are you today, my little pet, my own Alfie? How are you?
Every day, when Mr Hoppy looked over his balcony and saw Mrs Silver whispering endearments to Alfie and stroking his shell, he felt absurdly jealous.
Yes. You like that, don't you? You like your little shell being stroked, don't you?
Oh, I wouldn't mind becoming a tortoise myself, if it meant Mrs Silver stroking my shell each morning and whispering endearments to me like that. Oh, Mrs Silver, What wouldn't I do for you?
Alfie had been with Mrs. Silver for years, and he lived on her balcony summer and winter. Planks had been placed around the sides of the balcony so that Alfie could walk about without toppling over the edge. And in one corner, there was a little house into which Alfie would crawl every night to keep warm.
That's right, Alfie. In you go, into your nice, snug, warm little house. Night-night. Sleep well.
When the colder weather came along in November, Mrs. Silver would fill Alfie's house with dry hay, and the tortoise would crawl in there and bury himself deep under the hay and go to sleep for months on end without food or water. This is called hibernating. And in early spring, when Alfie felt the warmer weather through his shell, he would wake up and crawl very slowly out of his house onto the balcony. And Mrs. Silver would clap her hands and cry out with joy.
Alfie! Alfie, welcome back, my darling one. Oh, how I have missed you. Come to me. Let me pick you up and make a fuss of you.
It was at times like these that Mr. Hoppy wished more than ever that he could change places with Alfie and become a tortoise.
I'd let you make as much a fuss of me as you wanted, Mrs. Silver. I would. Oh, I would.
Now we come to a certain bright morning in May when something happened that changed and indeed electrified Mr. Hoppy's life. He was leaning over his balcony rail watching Mrs. Silver serving Alfie his breakfast.
Here's the heart of the lettuce for you, my lovely. A lovely, crisp heart of lettuce for my little sweetheart. And here's a slice of fresh tomato and a piece of crispy celery. Just what my little Alfie likes, isn't it?
Good morning, Mrs. Silver. Alfie's looking well this morning.
Yes, isn't he gorgeous? Isn't he just?
Yes, he's absolutely gorgeous. For a tortoise. But nothing like as gorgeous as you, Mrs. Silver. Oh, how pretty you are. How sweet, how gentle, how full of kindness. Oh, how my heart aches for you, Mrs. Silver. If you only did but know it.
I just do so wish he would grow a little faster, Mr. Hoppy. That's what I wish. Do you know, every spring when he wakes up from his winter sleep, I weigh him on the kitchen scales. And what do you think he's gained in all the 11 years I've had him?
I've no idea, Mrs. Silver.
I'll tell you. He's not gained more than 3 ounces. Oh, that's almost nothing.
And what does he weigh now?
A measly 13 ounces. About as much as a grapefruit.
Oh, I see. Well, it has to be said that tortoises are very slow growers. But on the other hand, they can live for 100 years.
I know that, Mr. Hoppy. But I do so wish that little Alfie would grow just a bit bigger. He's such a tiny wee fellow.
He seems just fine as he is.
No, Mr. Hoppy, he is not just fine. Try to think how miserable it must make him feel to be so titchy. Everyone wants to grow up. It makes me miserable to think of it.
Oh, Mrs. Silver, come now. You really would love him to grow bigger, wouldn't you?
And as he said it, an amazing idea came whooshing into his mind.
You really would love him to grow bigger, Mrs. Silver.
Of course I would. Oh, I'd give anything to make it happen. Why, I've seen pictures of giant tortoises that are so huge people can ride on their backs. If Alfie were to see those, he'd turn green with envy.
Mr. Hoppy's mind was spinning like a flywheel. Here, surely, was his big chance to win Mrs. Silver's love.
This is it. My chance. The chance I've been waiting for. I must grab it. I must grab it quick. Mrs. Silver, I do actually happen to know how to make tortoises grow faster, if that's really what you want.
You do? You do? Oh, please, tell me, Mr. Hoppy, please. Am I feeding him the wrong things? Is that it? Is that what I'm doing wrong?
No, Mrs. Silver. I'm sure you're giving Alfie just what he likes to eat.
Then what is it, Mr. Hoppy? What is it?
I worked in North Africa once.
Yes?
Well, that's where all these tortoises in England come from.
Yes?
And a Bedouin tribesman told me the secret.
Yes? What is it, Mr. Hoppy? Tell me. Oh, please. I beg you to tell me, Mr. Hoppy. I'll be your slave for life. Slave for life. Slave for life.
Oh, will you, Mrs. Silver? Will you? Wait there. Just wait there, Mrs. Silver. I'll have to go and write something down for you. I'm back. I've written it all down on this piece of paper.
Oh, let me see it. Do.
I'll tie it to this piece of string and lower it down to you, otherwise it might blow away.
Whatever you think best, Mr. Hoppy.
Here goes, then. I'll lower it down to you now.
Got it, Mr. Hoppy. Oh, but what does it mean? I can't understand it. Is it another language? It certainly looks like it.
Read it out, Mrs. Silver.
I don't think I can.
Try.
But it doesn't make sense.
Just read it as it's written.
Esio Trot. Esio Trot. Teg regib regib. Emok no. Esio Trot. Wog poo. Fup poo. Toos poo. Are you sure about this, Mr. Hoppy?
Carry on, Mrs. Silver. You're doing fine.
Gnoops poo. Wolb poo. Loose poo. Eggrog. Elzug. Futs. Plug. Tup no taff. Esio Trot. Tup no taff. Teg no. Elbog doof. I'm sorry, Mr. Hoppy, but I don't understand a single word of it.
It's tortoise language.
Tortoise language?
Tortoises are very backward creatures, you see. Therefore, they can only understand words that are written backwards. That's obvious, isn't it?
Well, I suppose so, in a manner of speaking. Even so.
Look at it again, Mrs. Silver.
Yes?
Look at the first words. Esio Trot. You see, Esio Trot is simply tortoise spelled backwards.
T-O-R-T-O-I-S-E. Tortoise. Why, so it is. So it is, Mr. Hoppy. How amazing.
All the other words are spelled backwards, too. Look at plug, for instance. P-L-U-G. Turn that round the other way, and what do you get?
G-U-L-P. Gulp. I see what you mean. So, Teg regib must be, G-E-T, get, B-I-G-G-E-R, bigger. Get bigger. Teg regib is get bigger.
Yes, Mrs. Silver, yes. And if you turn all the words round into human language, they simply say, tortoise, tortoise, get bigger, bigger. Come on, tortoise. Grow up, puff up, shoot up, spring up, blow up, swell up. Gorge, guzzle, stuff, gulp. Put on fat, tortoise, put on fat. Get on, gobble food.
I guess you're right. How clever. So, poo is only up backwards. I'm glad about that. To be honest, I did think there were an awful lot of poos in it. Are they something special?
Pooh is a very strong word in any language, especially with tortoises. Now, what you have to do, Mrs. Silver, is hold Alfie up to your face and whisper these words to him 3 times a day, morning, noon and night. Let me hear you practice them again.
Slowly, and stumbling a little over the strange words, Mrs. Silver read the whole message out loud again in tortoise language.
Esio Trot, Teg Regib Regib, Emok no Esio Trot, Wog Poo, Fop Poo, Twos Poo, Gnups Poo, Wolb Poo, Lews Poo, Egrog, Ilzug, Fats Plug, Tupno Taff, Esio Trot, Tupno Taff, Tegno, Elbog Doof. How was that, Mr. Hoppy?
Not bad at all. But try to get a little more expression into it when you say it to Alfie. If you do it properly, I'll bet you anything you like that in a few months' time he'll be twice as big as he is now.
I'll try it. I'll try anything, of course I will. But I can't believe it'll work.
Just wait and see, Mrs. Silver. Just wait and see.
Back in his flat, Mr. Hoppy was quivering all over with excitement.
You're slave for life, she said. You're slave for life. Oh, what bliss. What perfect, absolute bliss.
But there was a lot of work to be done before that happened. The only furniture in Mr. Hoppy's small living room was a table and 2 chairs. These he moved into his bedroom. Then he went out and bought a sheet of thick canvas and spread it over the entire living room floor to protect his carpet. Next, he got out the telephone book and wrote down the address of every pet shop in the city.
Perfect. Pets Station Road. Animal World High Street. Potter's Pet Emporium Royal Arcade.
There were 14 of them altogether. It took him 2 days to visit each pet shop and choose his tortoises. Mr. Hoppy, you see, wanted a great many tortoises, at least 100, maybe more, and he had to choose them very carefully. To you and me, there's not much difference between one tortoise and another. They differ only in their size and in the color of their shells. Alfie had a darkish shell, so Mr. Hoppy chose only the darker-shelled tortoises for his great collection. Good morning, sir. Can I help you?
I'd like some tortoises, please.
A tortoise, certainly, sir. We have some over here.
I need them to have darkish shells.
Darkish shells, I see.
And a variety of sizes from about 13 ounces upwards.
A variety of sizes, I see. How many tortoises would you be requiring, sir?
How many have you got?
Size, of course, was everything. Mr. Hoppy chose all sorts of different sizes, some weighing only slightly more than Alfie, others a great deal more. But he didn't want any that weighed less. Well, there we are, sir. 11 tortoises.
Thank you.
Feed 'em cabbage leaves, that's all they need, and a bowl of water.
Fine. Thanks again.
When he'd finished, Mr. Hoppy, in his enthusiasm, had bought no less than 140 tortoises. He carried them home in baskets, 10 or 15 at a time. He had to make a lot of trips, and he was quite exhausted by the end of it. But it was worth it. Boy, was it worth it. And what an amazing sight his living room was when they were all there together. The floor was swarming with tortoises of different sizes, some walking slowly about, some munching cabbage leaves, others drinking water from a big shallow dish. They made just the faintest rustling sound as they moved over the canvas sheet, but that was all.
Oh, look at the little devils. Look at them. Have you ever seen so many tortoises?
They were absolutely everywhere. In fact, there were so many that Mr. Hoppy had to pick his way carefully on his toes between this moving sea of brown shells whenever he walked across the room.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. I nearly trod on you there, didn't I? Right. On with the master plan.
Before he retired, Mr. Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus garage, and now he went back to his old place of work and asked his mates if he might use his old bench for an hour or two. What he had to do now was to make something that would reach down from his own balcony to Mrs. Silver's balcony and pick up a tortoise. For a mechanic like Mr. Hoppy, making something like that wasn't difficult.
That looks about right. Yes.
First, he made 2 metal claws or fingers, and these he attached to the end of a long metal tube.
Now, where did I put those pliers? Ah, there they are.
Next, he ran 2 stiff wires down inside the tube and connected them to the metal claws in such a way that when you pulled the wires, the claws closed. And when you pushed them, the claws opened.
Perfect.
Mr. Hoppy was ready to begin. Mrs. Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. And that made things a lot easier for Mr. Hoppy. So, on that first exciting afternoon, after he'd made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy went out onto his balcony armed with his long metal pole. He called this his tortoise catcher. He leaned over the balcony railings and slowly lowered the pole down onto Mrs. Silver's balcony below.
Easy does it. Easy. Aha! There he is. Hello, Alfie. You're about to go for a little ride.
Mr. Hoppy wiggled the tortoise catcher till it was right above Alfie. He pushed the hand lever so that the jaws opened wide. Then he lowered the 2 jaws neatly over Alfie's shell and pulled the lever. The claws closed tightly over the shell like 2 fingers on a hand. Then Mr. Hoppy hauled Alfie up onto his own balcony. It was easy.
Right. Let's weigh you then, young fella. Onto the scales with you. 13 ounces. Well, Alfie, looks like Mrs. Silver was right about your weight. And now, to find a tortoise to replace you with.
Holding Alfie in one hand, Mr. Hoppy picked his way carefully through his huge collection of tortoises to find one that had the same colour shell as Alfie and weighed exactly 2 ounces more. Two ounces is not much. It is less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But you see, the important thing in Mr. Hoppy's plan was to make sure that the new tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't notice it. But from his vast collection, it wasn't difficult to find just the tortoise he wanted.
That one there, I think. No. That one over there. Come here, my little beauty. Let's be having you. Yes, you'll do fine. Right, let's weigh you. 15 ounces. Absolutely spot on. And my, just look at him next to Alfie. Even I can hardly tell the difference. But he is bigger. Bigger by 2 ounces. Hello, tortoise number 2. Aren't you the lucky one? You'll soon be meeting Mrs. Silver.
Mr. Hoppy took tortoise number 2 out onto the balcony and gripped it in the claws of his tortoise catcher.
Here we are, number 2. That's Mrs. Silver's balcony down there. I'll just lower you down. Easy. Does it? Good. Oh, and what could be better? There's a nice fresh lettuce leaf right beside you.
Tortoise number 2 had never eaten tender, juicy lettuce leaves before. It had only had thick old cabbage leaves. It loved the lettuce and started chomping away at it with great gusto. Then there followed a rather nervous 2 hours wait for Mrs. Silver to return from work. Hidden between 2 huge plants, Mr. Hoppy held his breath as he peered over his railing to watch Mrs. Silver come out onto her balcony. Would she see any difference between the new tortoise and Alfie? It was going to be a tense moment.
Will she notice? Oh, will she notice?
Alfie! Oh, Alfie! I'm home! Mummy's back! Have you missed me? Where are you? Oh, there you are, Alfie. And what a nice lettuce leaf you've got there, haven't you? My, you do seem hungry today. It must be Mr. Hoppy's magic words I've been whispering to you. Shall I read them to you again, Alfie? Shall I? Would you like that? Yes, of course you would. And I expect you'd like your little shell stroked too, wouldn't you? Come here, then. Esio Trot, Esio Trot, Teg Regib, Regib. Emok no, Esio Trot, Wog Poo, Fup Poo, Toos Poo, Knurps Poo.
She thinks it's Alfie she's talking to. She really does. She's not noticed at all. Oh, it's working. It's working.
Fats, plug, tap no taff, Esio Trot, tap no taff, teg no, el bog doof.
Right. Better let her know I'm here. Good evening, Mrs. Silver. And how is Alfie tonight?
Oh, hello, Mr. Hoppy. He's lovely, thank you. And he's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this before. It must be those magic words of yours.
You never know. You never know.
Mr. Hoppy waited 7 whole days before he made his next move. On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mrs. Silver was at work, he lifted tortoise number 2 from the balcony below and brought it into his living room.
Now, if you weigh 15 ounces, we need one that weighs 17 ounces, don't we? Yeah, that looks a likely tortoise. 17 ounces exactly. Perfect.
And so Mr. Hoppy lowered tortoise number 3 down onto the balcony below.
There we are.
As you will have guessed by now, Mr. Hoppy's plan was a very simple one. If a creature grows slowly enough, I mean very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice it has grown at all, especially if you see it every day. It's the same with children. They're actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice until they grow out of their clothes.
Slowly does it. Don't hurry it. Slow but sure. just like a tortoise.
Just like a tortoise indeed, Mr. Hoppy. So, this is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, there was Alfie. Weight, 13 ounces. At the end of the first week, there was tortoise number 2. Weight, 15 ounces. At the end of the second week, there was tortoise number 3. Weight, 17 ounces. And so on, until by the end of the 7th week, there was tortoise number 8. Weight, 27 ounces. Alfie's weight was 13 ounces. Tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. So, very slowly, over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver's pet had more than doubled in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy, peering down over his railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silver hardly noticed at all during the whole operation. Only once had she looked up and said,
"You know, Mr. Hoppy, I do believe he's getting bigger. What do you think?"
Well, I can't see a lot of difference myself.
Oh, really?
Time I called a halt and got her to weigh a tortoise, I think. I say, Mrs. Silver?
Yes, Mr. Hop... Oh, look at that. Look, Mr. Hoppy, look. Come quick. Alfie's too big to get through the door of his little house. He must have grown enormously.
Weigh him. Take him in and weigh him quick.
Mrs. Silver did just that. And in half a minute, she was back holding the tortoise in both hands above her head and shouting.
Guess what, Mr. Hoppy? Guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big as he was before. Oh, you darling. Oh, you great, big, wonderful boy.
Are you talking to me, Mrs. Silver?
Just look what clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you.
Oh, evidently not. Still, she did call me clever. She must feel something for me.
And Mr. Hoppy felt suddenly very brave.
Mrs. Silver? Oh, I say, Mrs. Silver?
Yes, Mr. Hoppy?
Do you think I, could pop down to your balcony and hold Alfie myself?
Why, of course you can. Come down at once.
She's asked me down to her own balcony. At last. Here I am.
Oh, come on in, Mr. Hoppy. No need to stand on ceremony. Come in. Just look at him. Isn't he grand?
He's a big, good-sized tortoise now. I'll say that much for him.
And you did it. Mr. Hoppy, you're a miracle man indeed. But what am I going to do about his house? He must have a house to go into at night. But now he can't get through the door.
I see what you mean.
As Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver watched, Alfie, or rather tortoise number 8, was trying to push his way through the door. But it was no use. And if he wasn't careful, he'd get well and truly stuck.
I shall have to enlarge the door.
Oh, don't do that, Mrs. Silver. You mustn't go chopping up such a pretty little house. After all, he only needs to be just a tiny bit smaller, and he could get in easily.
But how can he possibly get smaller?
That's simple. Change the magic words. Instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get a bit smaller. But in tortoise language, of course.
Will that work?
Of course it'll work.
Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy.
Have you got a piece of paper? And I'll write it down for you.
There's some just inside, I think. Yes, here we are. Here we are, Mr. Hoppy.
Right. That'll do it, Mrs. Silver. Mark my words.
Esio Trot, Esio Trot. Take a Artibrellams. Artibrellams. Well, I don't mind trying it, but look here. I wouldn't want him to get titchy small all over again, Mr. Hoppy.
He won't, dear lady, he won't. Say it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then see what happens. We might be lucky.
If it works, then you are the cleverest man alive.
The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoise up from her balcony and carried it inside.
Now all I have to do is find one a shade smaller. Just small enough to slip easily through the door of Mrs. Silver's little house. What about you, little fellow? No, bit big, I'd say. You look just the right size, don't you? Now, let's just put you in the tortoise catcher. It's all right. It doesn't hurt. There. Now, let's try you for size.
Carefully, Mr. Hoppy lowered the tortoise down to Mrs. Silver's balcony. Then, still gripping the tortoise, he tested it to see if it would go through the door.
Oh, dear me, no. You're just a bit too big, aren't you?
So Mr. Hoppy brought it back up again and chose another. Again, he tested it. And this one went through nicely.
Excellent.
He placed the tortoise number 9, in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce and went inside to await Mrs. Silver's homecoming.
Oh, Mrs. Silver, are you in for a surprise?
That evening, Mr. Hoppy was watering his plants on the balcony when Mrs. Silver returned.
Will she notice? Will she?
Mr. Hoppy! Mr. Hoppy!
She has.
Where are you, Mr. Hoppy? Mr. Hoppy! Will you just look at this?
What's up, Mrs. Silver? Something happened?
Oh, Mr. Hoppy, it's worked. It's worked.
What's worked? Oh, Alfie, you mean? Why, that's marvellous, isn't it? I said it would, didn't I?
You did. And it has, Mr. Hoppy. Oh, I'm so happy. I can't tell you. Your magic words have worked again on Alfie, Mr. Hoppy. He can now get through the door of his little house again. It's a miracle. A miracle.
Can I come down and have a look?
You don't have to ask. Of course you can come down, my dear man. Come down and see the wonders you have worked upon my darling Alfie.
Mr. Hoppy turned and ran from the balcony into the living room, jumping on tiptoe like a ballet dancer between a sea of tortoises that covered the floor. He flung open his front door and flew down the steps 2 at a time.
This is it. Oh, Mrs. Silver. The greatest moment of my life is coming up now. I mustn't bish it. I mustn't bosh it. I must keep very calm. I must keep very calm.
Mrs. Silver was already at her door, waiting to welcome him with a huge smile on her face, and she literally flung her arms round him.
You really are the most wonderful man I've ever met. You can do anything. Come in at once and let me make you a cup of tea. That's the very least you deserve.
A few minutes later, Mr. Hoppy was seated in one of Mrs. Silver's comfortable armchairs, sipping his tea. But inside, he was all of a twitter.
Oh dear, it's now or never.
He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back at him.
She's smiling at me. I must do it. I must ask her. I'll never get another chance. I know I won't.
That smile of hers, so warm and friendly, suddenly gave him the courage he needed.
Mrs. Silver?
Yes, Mr. Hoppy.
Will you... Mrs. Silver, please will you marry me?
Why, Mr. Hoppy, I didn't think you'd ever get round to asking me. Of course I'll marry you.
Oh, Mrs. Silver.
Oh, Mr. Hoppy. It's all due to Alfie, you know.
I know. Good old Alfie. We'll keep him forever.
Forever and ever.
The very next afternoon, Mr. Hoppy took all his other tortoises back to the pet shops and said they could have them for nothing. Then he cleaned up his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage nor a trace of tortoise. A few weeks later, Mrs. Silver became Mrs. Hoppy.
I now pronounce you man and wife.
And the two of them lived very happily ever after. Now we've got all that lovey-dovey stuff out of the way, I expect you're wondering what happened to the very first tortoise. Little Alfie. Well, that's me. Well, I was bought a week later from the pet shop Mr. Hoppy took me to by a small girl called Roberta Squibb, and I settled down in Roberta's garden. She fed me lettuce and tomato slices and lovely crispy celery, and in the winters I hibernated in a box of dried leaves in the tool shed. Oh, but that was all a long, long time ago. Roberta grew up and got married, and now she has 2 children of her own. She lives in another house, but I'm still with her. Still a much-loved family pet, I'm glad to say. And Roberta reckons that I must be about 30 years old. It's taken me all that time to grow to twice the size I was when Mrs. Silver had me. But I made it in the end.